Chapter 5 might be the last chapter in the Poppy franchise, and today I wanted to discuss everything we can expect in the possible final game, from its plot, new and returning characters, and even some early estimates for when the game could release. So firstly, let's talk about what characters will be in Chapter 5, and for starters, we know that Poppy will obviously make some kind of return. They left her story on a big cliffhanger in Chapter 4, running away from us into a crevice, never to be seen again, and I mean, the game is literally named after her, how could she not return? Plus, I think our pink fluffy pal Kissy will almost certainly come back, as after the explosion in Chapter 4, we can clearly see her still alive at the top of all of the rubble before we are separated, which is a huge loose end I'm sure they're going to tie up with this title. And of course, we know the prototype is coming back. He's probably going to be the main focus of the entire chapter, as we'll discuss shortly. So obviously, he's going to make an appearance along with the highly awaited Huggy Wuggy, who came back in Chapter 4's final scene and will presumably be in Chapter 5 in some kind of injured but still alive state, missing an arm but being as aggressive as ever. And hopefully in this chapter we can learn what truly happened to Huggy from Chapter 1 to now, especially when it comes to who repaired him and why. But outside of like the obvious confirmed characters, there are tons of other rumored characters, like for one, Pianosaurus's bandmates. We learned in Chapter 4 that Pianosaurus was a part of a band that contained multiple other dinosaur themed instrument toys, which with all the love and protest about Pianosaurus and his lack of screen time in Chapter 4, it could make sense to introduce his other friends into Chapter 5 as compensation. Of course, there's Bron the dinosaur, who former developers said was supposed to be put into every single chapter but kept consistently getting cut, so now knowing he is at least on the developers' minds, he could make a last second appearance this game. There's also Boxy Boo, who is a massive fan favorite and we know is still alive in the factory, but despite seemingly inspiring the logo for the prison and having everybody begging for him to be put into the main game since Chapter 3, we are still waiting for him to appear, and especially since in the Hour of Joy tape we saw he was in an area we haven't explored before in the game as far as I've seen, he might be lurking around an area in Chapter 5 instead. Plus, while maybe it's a stretch, it's possible we could see Mommy Longlegs and Catnap in the game as well, at least in some way, because if we are finally going to be encountering and learning about the prototype this chapter, we still don't know what he was doing with the bodies of each of our victims from past chapters, and whether he was using them for his own body, or since a lot of people think the prototype was the one who repaired Huggy, he could possibly be bringing them back from the dead as well. I'm assuming we will find out where they both went this time around. But returning toys aside, of course we can also assume there's going to be a new Chapter 5 main antagonist. Every chapter has gotten a new main villain, obviously to draw fresh hype to the titles as they release, so we could pretty safely confirm it'll be the same way for Chapter 5, along with presumably multiple new side characters. And while obviously we are way too early to even discuss who these might be, a running theory on at least one of the Chapter 5 characters is that in Chapter 4 we got a weekly checkup letter here for experiment 1424, currently the latest experiment in Playtime Co's known history by quite a bit, being created in 1995 and last checked up in April 1995, 4 months before the Hour of Joy, where they discuss the seemingly failed experiment capable of speech but was otherwise incoherent, unable to respond to any questions or commands directly, and was unable to move most of his limbs properly or eat. And this character, as far as I know, isn't ever explained or referenced again in the entire game, so people naturally suspect we could be seeing them in Chapter 5 as foreshadowed here, which wouldn't be the craziest theory. They previously foreshadowed Doughy, one of Chapter 4's biggest characters, in a tape log all the way back in Chapter 3, named after his experiment number 1322. So it's not at all out of the question for the devs to be teasing experiment numbers early. You just probably wouldn't expect somebody who could barely even eat for itself to be a main antagonist or anything. Honestly, it'd probably be a side character if this ends up being correct. Also guys, we are so close to hitting 300k, so if you like the content, make sure to subscribe and also like the video so it reaches out to more people. Thank you guys in advance. But now, discussing Chapter 5's potential plot / locations, the chapter story is honestly shockingly straightforward. We know the title is obviously going to take place mainly in the labs, the home of the prototype according to a Chapter 3 VHS tape.
And as for the prototype, his home is in the labs.
And the place we go into at the end of Chapter 4. There may be other smaller locations, like how Chapter 4 was based on the prison but branched out into a bunch of different areas, but when entering the labs in the last chapter, we get hit with the red gas, falling asleep and presumably waking up in the next game starts. And as Poppy told us in Chapter 3 and 4, our goal will then be to defeat the prototype once and for all, and also to find the orphans he was keeping down in this area and save them so we could destroy the factory and everything inside of it to leave its horrific specific story in the past. And while that seems pretty cut and dry simple, in chapter 4, the prototype actually ended up stealing the explosives we were going to use to destroy the factory and instead use them against us. So while they don't exactly tell us what the new plan is, I'm guessing somehow we're gonna have to retrieve the rest of the explosives back from the prototype. Maybe we'll finally get to face off against him and get them that way, and then we could save the orphans and escape the factory. The only other thing we know about the story outside of the game is that a former developer in a previous video told us chapter 5 story was already written, and in another message said there was more unrevealed lore about Poppy's past and the Hour of Joy, so we could be learning more about those two things in chapter 5, assuming they don't change the story up. But now let's talk about chapter 5's release date, or at least what we can expect, because honestly this is where things get a bit confusing. So as you guys may or may not know, it was a big selling point with chapter 4 that after the long wait for chapter 3 delayed by the release of Project Playtime, their multiplayer game, and it being by far their most ambitious release yet, there was a big focus on getting the next chapters out sooner so we wouldn't have to wait years again, which led to them releasing chapter 4 just 1 year to the date after chapter 3, which while it was great to not have to wait as long, I made a whole video discussing how a lot of people felt like the game ended up coming out rushed and not as polished as maybe they were hoping for. So while the devs were originally super focused with trying to get these chapters out quick and efficiently, they have already publicly stated they are listening to all of the feedback, and more than likely chapter 5 is going to have a lot more time and effort put into it to ensure that it meets the large expectations of fans after the past couple games, and will be a lot more polished and less buggy, at least I hope. And if this is true, I highly doubt we'll be seeing chapter 5 release in January like the past couple have. In fact, I think a whole lot later, as the developers have also over the past year or so began to tease in interviews that they are working on their own brand new IPs outside of Poppy Playtime to try and expand their brand. Since of course, if chapter 5 is the last chapter, or at the very latest maybe a chapter 6, they will need to have more plans to continue development with games. I'm sure we'll get spin-offs for Poppy, like maybe an exploration of whatever the Playtime Park was from chapter 3, or maybe a prequel from before the Hour of Joy, but they have also stated wanting to work on non-Poppy IP, all of which is going to draw more attention away from chapter 5's development and cause things to slow down, similarly to what happened when Project Playtime was being developed, causing chapter 3 to be pushed to the side for literally over a year. So honestly, with all this stuff being said, while Mob has grown as a company and have gotten a lot more efficient with what they make, chapter 5, especially if it's going to be the last chapter, is going to have a lot more time put into it, along with the other things that will draw their attention away, which while if true means we will get a better final product long term, most likely means I wouldn't really be expecting chapter 5 to release anytime until maybe spring summer 2026, and if not that, even later. I don't know, it's too early to tell. Maybe the developers have a much bigger team than they did in past years and chapter 5 won't take as long as maybe I'm expecting. But just for fun, comment down below a random date you think chapter 5 will release at, and if enough of you guys comment, one of you guys is definitely going to be right.